So
looks good.
Okay, thank you. So the objectives, since I've used half my time already, objectives of the talk, I'm going to talk about the use of a value chain concept as a tool for not just characterizing and evaluating value, but for thinking about the whole information process. As an economist, I'm going to be coming at this somewhat from a valuation perspective, but there's a lot of other uses and reasons for thinking about value chains. Do a little bit about talking about economics, the role of economics in this for the weather, water, climate community, and provide a couple examples basically of my work where we've used value chain concepts. Not trying to say that my work is the best or the only work, but it's obviously the stuff I'm most familiar with, so I'll use some examples there and perhaps a few short ones elsewhere. The talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about what value is, a very short economic perspective, what the value chain is, go through a little bit more depth on how I've kind of thought about that, put up a couple different representations of the value chain. I think we'll see quite a few of those over the next 12 hours. And then 3 examples where the value chain concept was part of a project, including the three that I've been involved with, one at NCAR on solar energy, one for NOAA on winter storms, impact-based decision support, and an ongoing one on GOES-R benefits, which I'll actually move quite a bit of that to the kind of exercise. Then talk about some conclusions from this and provide references. So first of all, very simply, what is value from an economics point of view? And I realize there are many different perspectives of what value is, what value means. Always like to emphasize that economics is a social science, and one of our primary focuses is studying value in terms largely about how different economic agents make decisions to increase their value or their benefits. In economics, I say that value is ultimately a matter of what makes people better off, even though we do quite often talk about increasing profits or cutting costs to industry or reducing damages. All of that eventually translates into what makes people better off, which is the ultimate measure of value or of benefits. So what is value? I'm not going to be able to go through these concepts, but these are just a laundry list of some concepts from economics that relate to this. Benefits, there's a lot of work in economics on decision making under uncertainty, about what information is, about what the value of information is, and that's a key concept, especially in the value chain approach. What value added, because we're inclined to say that there's value added at the different steps in a value chain. So that's about all the economics, and if you want more information on that, we can provide some more in-depth background on econ. So why do we think, or why do we keep this concept of a value chain keeps coming up? From my perspective as an economist, it's a way of using economics concepts to kind of explain the hydromet information process, all the way from weather observations down to value realization. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about for the next 20 minutes or so. From an economic point of view, we usually a very simple or basic modeling approach. So there's different stakeholders or decision makers, and we could very simply break that down into they have objectives, they have resources, and they have constraints. And that very simple modeling approach, putting those together, we can explain most of what economics does in terms of analyzing decisions and measuring value. I've advocated the use of the value chain so that we can tie information or studies of hydromet products and services to benefits so that the estimates are valid and reliable. There's a lot of economic studies which are back of the envelope, which are not necessarily considered valid or reliable studies of the benefits of information. I think value chain can also be used to examine how user relevant information can drive back up the value chain to drive product development. And I think it also helps develop an understanding across project members in a research project such as HIWeather and a couple of the projects I'll talk about as examples. So digging down then, so what is the information or weather information value chain? And I kind of qualify this by saying this is perfectly applicable, I think, to climate information, hydro information, any information process that starts with observations, say, physical process on one side and goes through the social processes to benefit realization. This is a graphic I've used quite often. It's not necessarily the best one. Brian Golding's paper has another one. Well, we won't. I don't think I bring that up in my talk today, but that gets used quite often in the HIWeather talk. But this is just one way of representing it, and usually we kind of pull this apart and put it back together for different specific uses. So the weather information value chain, it's not a method or a scientific method or a way to study value. It's just a mental model or a heuristic to frame the discussion so that we can understand the process of the use of information. Obviously, it's not linear in the real world. It's maybe more of like a spaghetti diagram or a swamp that things just move in all different directions. And it is end to end to end, so that hopefully information, the arrows in this case are going from left to right, but we really would say that information flows back up as well. To be determined in talking about any particular value chain is that, what do the boxes represent? What do the arrows represent? Very simplistically, we could say that the boxes represent stakeholders or decision makers or information processors, and the arrows represent information. Generally, I would kind of high level say within each of the box, a stakeholder receives information, uses his or hers resources, repackages that or reformats that and sends that on to another agent. So it's kind of a step-by-step process. So again, just emphasizing that I think this is applicable to weather, water, and climate information, and even more broadly to environmental information or other information. One thing I kind of forgot to point out, the value chain concept is actually used in economics in a different way in terms of like a production process value chain, especially in agriculture where each step of the process adds value. What we're talking about here in terms of a value chain is the flow of information, and information as a product kind of moves from step to step as opposed to, say, physical commodities used for agricultural production or something like that. So on the far left, I would say weather, for the most part, I will say is taken as a given. This could be applied to weather modification, but that's not necessarily an area where information plays a big role in terms of valuation. All types of weather, I would say too, from everything from hazardous weather, which is the focus of HIWeather, to just day-to-day weather. There's significant difference in variety of observation systems globally and locally, everything from the satellites to your car, people's cell phones are now part of observation systems. We're now using drones, radars. There's a multitude of inputs in terms of observing the environment to gather data, which is then transformed into information. Some go straight through to nowcasting. Quite a bit goes through some type of modeling, whether it's climate models, numerical weather prediction. And again, there's transfer of information or data between the different steps. Forecasting, whether it's weather forecast, climate forecasts, nowcasting again. Multiple different ways that modeling and forecasting is done. Dissemination used to be pretty limited set of options for this, but now everything word of mouth, sirens, newspapers probably not as much as it used to be. I used to get my forecast in the newspaper, but now if I get it 20 times a day on my cell phone or more, even the social media is a major distributor of information. I kind of make a distinction between dissemination, which is the process of putting it out, and communication. I'm not a communication expert by any means, but I've done a lot of work with communication people, and that's a key part of this information value chain is the transfer of information by communication processes, which includes all aspects of the information format, content, detail, uncertainty. This just shows some visual representation, some text, but also a lot of information verbally by graphics on the internet and whatnot. That then goes to, and I'm kind of skipping, I'll go into some detail on, say, emergency managers, broadcasters, different roles people play, but goes to some type of a decision maker who then perceives or interprets that information to make a decision, whether it's a threat or probabilities or the reliability or trust of that information. Some people basically can spend their whole career studying trust issues. I think that's, key parts of this is the social science aspects of interpreting and understanding information. This is an example. When I was in Taiwan years ago, came across this. It was a experimental spaghetti model, intensity graphs, that said basically it's brand new and is practically guaranteed to be broken. And I'm not sure what this graphic would actually communicate, but I think it would communicate that you need to find a different source of information. So that information then may go into decision making. There's, decision sciences can play a role here. Economics works closely with decision sciences. Do you shelter? Do you evacuate? Do you buy corn? Do you sell corn? Do you wear sunglasses or a coat? Do you drive into the intersection or don't you? In this case, this gentleman probably should not have driven into the intersection. And then that's kind of quite often where the weather enterprise stops from down to the decision making. That ex ante, or before the weather is actualized, is where economic values of information are measured. So going back to the idea that values are subject to the objectives of the decision maker and his or her resources and constraints, I just want to emphasize that the decisions are not just a factor controlled or influenced by the information that individual receives. This article or graphic by Blakey et al. Really points out, especially with vulnerability, that vulnerability is culturally and socially determined quite often by cultural processes or situations going back decades or centuries. Everything in terms of income distribution, gender roles, power and authority. So the decisions are made in the context of this. And I try to kind of bring that up too, because quite often perhaps to get outcomes that may be more socially favorable, it may not be a matter of providing better or different information, but perhaps addressing some of these issues in terms of vulnerability and the root causes of vulnerability. Again, not my area of expertise, but I think it's an important thing to remember. There are external constraints and resources influencing economic outcomes. So the outcomes per se, so when weather, say, decisions have been made and the weather is actualized, then we say that that's kind of ex post. That's not really then economic values, that's economic impacts. I know the HIWeather is developing economic impacts catalog. That does not necessarily get at the value of the weather or even potentially the potential value of the weather. It does get at the impacts from weather, water, climate. Ex post, information does not change the impacts after the fact, but may change the outcome before. So it's an economic impacts are ex post. On the other hand, economic values are ex ante or occur before the weather is actualized. Then I also point out with the value chain, something to be aware of is that there are all the different actors, all the different stakeholders, all the different decision makers, from the National Hydromet Services to broadcasters, emergency managers, private sector meteorology is playing a larger and larger role in several countries, to the different economic sectors, everything transportation, energy, retail, to the individual households and decision makers, to the public as the endpoint of economic values or measurement of economic values. And again, each stakeholder or decision maker in this process has their own set of objectives, their own resources and constraints that transform or control or affect their use of the information or their transformation of the information. And recognizing that maybe an emergency manager has a very different objective than, say, someone in the transportation field or someone building satellites for observations, is that the value chain is not a simple linear process, but goes through all these different actors and agents with different roles that they play. So ultimately, economic values are this endpoint of this very complex, nonlinear process of transforming weather observations into economic values used in decision making. And I feel we largely have to be aware of, or at least be able to tell the story end to end and end to end to end to be able to derive valid economic benefit estimates, or even assess impacts in a valid way. So through this kind of template up is one way that we've kind of created to say, how do we take this value chain concept and start working with it with any particular value chain process. So every process that involves creation of information to some decision maker at the end may have a different value chain. In this case, this would be, say, a table you could start filling out, kind of a cute little acronym, the value of information, which I said is the key concept from an economic point of view. Characterization and evaluation. By characterization, I mean, how do we describe it, talk about it, understand information? How do we measure it? What's its content, format, all the attributes of information that would be studied in other fields and not just in economics as well. And then evaluation, kind of along the lines of verification. I kind of look at economics as a method of very much end user verification of the value or content of information. So you could use this template, and we'll maybe talk about this a little bit in the case study, to talk about the stakeholders. You know, what are the stakeholders for observations for these different, for dissemination, for perception, for decision making? What are their resources, constraints, and so on. So again, this template might be something you could start to use to characterize or build a value chain. And there's many other ways of representing value chains. This is one from a article with Rebecca Morrison, Harold Brooks, Barb Brown, Phil Ganderton, and Brian Mills, where we were talking about developing a research agenda for the North American Thorpex project. Similar idea that we're starting with forecasting, going down to outcomes, but this specifically points out on the left-hand side that non-weather information feeds into decision making. That verification parallels this all the way down the route, all the way down from OBS to values, and the valuation parallels that. And I think there should be or is close parallels between verification and valuation exercises. Another use of the value chain, this is a WMO 2015 book, which was sponsored by WMO, World Bank, and USAID, which is available, I'll say, plug, this is available free on the internet, explaining economics for national hydromet services, where we use the value chain concept to kind of frame the discussion throughout the book, so we knew which part of the book, or readers could tell where in the value chain the book was talking about this. So get a little bit of time left. I'll go through these three case studies more as examples of value chains than as the valuation part, and skip through the GOES-R benefits one, because I do come back to that in our exercise in a few minutes. So the DOE research project that U.S. Department of Energy funded this research at NCAR. Sue Haupt was the lead PI on this, where we're looking at using or improving forecasts for utility scale solar power generation, largely basically improving solar irradiance forecasts, so they knew how much power they were getting off, or were going to get off their utility facility or their solar power facilities. There's a couple papers and reports on this available. Kind of skip through that, but the use of the value chain in this project actually started from day one. The project kickoff meeting we had in Boulder with all the different components of the project. We used the value chain to start talking across between the observing people, the engineers, the programmers, the utility people, the stakeholders, so we could talk across the different parts of the project and identify roles and how that project was going to develop. This graphic developed by Sue Haupt, the kind of ovals underneath the value chain here show all the different tools or apps, not really apps, but areas in this where research was undertaken to develop or improve this solar power forecasting effort. Again, the articles can provide more information there. My role in this was as the very far right side to try to get some economic benefits of this, but also to kind of bring in this idea of the value chain as an integrative tool for the project. I'm not going to go through the details on the economic analysis, but basically the mean absolute errors in the forecasting were reduced significantly through this research project. We then used something called production cost modeling, which is a tool used by the energy utilities to make decisions on what power plants they're going to use, and ran some simulations with and without the improved forecasts to see the different costs that they incurred under different kind of regimes of forecast error. Without going through all the details of the modeling, basically found that the value of the improved forecasts for the one energy utility who ran this model was almost $800 or a little over $800,000 a year. And then when we aggregated that up nationally over 24 years, came up with an estimate of about $400 to $500 million in benefits potentially related to this project. And again, that's the economic analysis tagged on to the value chain concept here. Second project I'm going to talk about is a recent one completed Apt Consulting. I was a consultant for them for NOAA, looking at the potential of trying to develop methods for looking at the value of undertaking impact-based decision support. In the value chain in this this study, basically we're trying to figure where was the entry point for IDSS or impact-based decision support. And this value chain graphic that we developed for the project shows that IDSS kind of fits in this point between the forecast and warnings and between the decision makers and the mitigating actions they can undertake. So also emphasizing that for any value chain exercise, that your entry point can be wherever you want, whether it's starting with OBS or starting with valuation. But in this case, we developed a model partly to say, where does IDSS fit in here? And then we looked at the potential economic impact in aviation, transport, and energy of changes in winter storms in the New York City area with and without IDSS. This kind of shows graphically the idea that winter storms, the horizontal axis is the magnitude of the storm, the vertical axis, the impact, and the shift downward of the curve suggests that with IDSS, the impacts can be lessened or reduced. Won't go through the methods as much, but we did use a number of kind of interview protocols, benefits transfer methods to try to monetize the benefits of IDSS in this case study, kind of really just comparing two winter storms initially. Hang on. And found, found different impacts in aviation, ground transport, energy, which suggested potential significant benefits from undertaking impact-based decision support, which is really taking that step between the National Hydromet Service and their core users to help them understand and use the information better. So the third study, and I'll go through this kind of quickly because we come back to this in a bit at the exercise, but the GOES-R socioeconomic benefit study is still somewhat underway. I'm a consultant to Aerospace Corporation with Michael Jamakowski and David Lugar. This study was funded by the GOES Program Office to try to develop methods or look at how can they look at the benefits or quantify the benefits of the GOES-R satellite series. Pretty expensive piece of equipment put up there, trying to justify that. Also, partly in anticipation that in 10, 15 years, they're going to have to put up the GOES or the GeoXO series and getting a running start and doing some valuation work for that to understand how to do that. So basically, we decided to look at just for the first step, looking at benefits to the general public of hurricane forecasts using benefits transfer, which basically means you're using existing benefit studies and applying to the existing case instead of undertaking primary or brand new benefit studies. So the value chain, and we'll talk about this in more detail. Started with my concept, used the NOAA fleet study value chain, which is a series of studies done by NOAA on their fleet observing system, and adapted that to a GOES-R hurricane value chain. Again, we used it as on the economic side. We're trying to link the potential improvements in hurricane forecasts from GOES-R to economic outcomes in terms of willingness to pay of members of the general public. Used expert elicitation to try to identify the percentage of hurricane forecast improvement attributable to GOES-R and tie that to an existing benefit study of the willingness to pay for improved forecasts. I'll kind of skip through this. I think I come back to this in a little bit later. The expert elicitation, again, was trying to attribute improvements in hurricane forecast to the GOES-R satellite. I'll skip through all that. So basically, I'll come back to that case study in a little bit. In conclusion, so the 3 different value chain studies used value chains for different purposes. One, to integrate the research team. One, to understand where this IDSS fits into the value chain. And a third one, the GOES-R study, kind of really to frame the economic study, the benefits of this observing system. So in conclusion, I'd say that economics has a role in demonstrating the value of weather information. I think there's potential for further, as user relevant verification develops, to tie that to economic verification or measures. And the value chain really is trying to understand the end-to-end information process. So that value chain can be used as for understanding value creation, for integrating a project. It's fully applicable, I think, in other social sciences, in communication and decision making, even anthropology, sociology, psychology can all play a role in framing and using this concept for understanding information processes. So with that, I'll say thank you. Here's some of the references that are in the presentation. So with that, I hope I still have you.
Thank you, Jeff. So if you can turn off your mic for a sec.